Good afternoon, everybody. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and this is my addendum to For My Students. And this comes because I received a very long personal message from one of my YouTube subscribers who happens to be a college student. And it is so lengthy in what he said that I'm not going to sit here and read it. I mean, obviously I read the last one. This was way too long. But I'm going to paraphrase some of the things he said. And the first thing he indicated to me was that he watched all 11 parts of this presentation, and he felt very enlightened by what I had said. He didn't agree with everything I said, but he agreed with quite a bit of it. One of the things he pointed out was, he said, what you're doing isn't necessarily wrong, but it's how you're communicating your points that seems to be the problem. He said, obviously, a lot of the people you're dealing with really don't have a mastery of social media, despite what they'd like to tell you. Okay? They have misconceptions about social media that they should not have. He said, here is what I suggest you do. Number one, when you go to one of these public videos and you start reading through all these comments, he says, I would like for you to address them on a comment-by-comment basis. He says, that's the first thing I want you to do. He says, secondly, he says, I want you, because you're getting this all the time, he says, I want you to tell these people in every single one of these videos why they got your video response, and specifically read their comment to that public video which prompted you to send a comment to them. He said, furthermore, on an individual case-by-case basis, he says, from now on, you tell them and let them know, because apparently they don't know this, he says, you need to tell them that employers are actually reading these comments just as much as you are. And one of the reasons why you are actually talking to these people is to get them to understand that if they continue to sound as empty-headed as they do in some of these comments, that employers are going to get the perception that these people don't have minds, and that's why they won't hire them. He said, too many people don't realize that, and he says, Ted, you need to tell them that kind of thing. He says, you really need to tell them on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, they're going to think that what they're doing is okay, which it is not. He says, you and I both know this. Apparently they don't. He says, you also need to bring up the subject on a case-by-case basis, that when they are using a smartphone, they need to proofread their responses before sending them out, because otherwise employers will think that these people are bad spellers, have poor grammar, and poor vocabulary. And he says that that's part of the reason why they don't get jobs. He says, you know that, I know that, but they don't know that. He says, I can't imagine them getting out of high school without knowing these kind of things, but he says apparently they do. He says that that's bad. He said, furthermore, he says, you need to get them to think before they speak. And he cited some examples. He says, when you went after Dan Brown, obviously the ones who responded back to you had never done any research on bad habits, addictions, or anything like that. They knew nothing about what they were talking about. They were just giving you a flip answer. He says, that's wrong. He said, because they're not seeing things from your point of view. He said, it's the same thing with how to disturb reality. These people have never really experienced poverty, because if they had, they wouldn't respond the same way. He said they weren't very careful in watching what How to Disturb Reality actually said, because otherwise they would have figured out what you were saying in response to him. So he says you need to get them to think a little bit more. And he said the best way to do that is to say, have you ever been impoverished? Have you ever read stories about people who have been impoverished? If not, read that material first, then watch my response to How to Disturb Reality. He says, that was your mistake. He says, you were right in what you said about how to disturb reality, but he says you were wrong in the way you were trying to get them to think. He says you were telling them what to think instead of getting them to think. And he says that was your error. He says, you're right. Apparently you do know things that they don't know. If they did know, they would think a lot differently. And your responses has clearly shown this. So that's what he told me. And a further example was, he said, you need to ask these people if they've ever heard of social anxiety disorder before telling them about social anxiety disorder, and then make it clear that had Beauty Crush known about social anxiety disorder, it is very unlikely that she would have made the video the way she did. She would have put the disclaimer in there. So you're trying to get the point across that Beauty Crush did very poor research before making her presentation, which caused you to object. And he says, your point about Dan Brown was absolutely true. He says, when you have a blueberry pie and you have 6 people that want a slice of that pie, and each person wants an equal slice of that pie, you don't divide the people, you divide the pie. His economic knowledge is totally backwards. He says, you were right about that. And he says, as for Jeff Bliss, he says, there's one thing you did not prove that I hope in this video you will prove. He says, I know you're going to make a video about this, so he says, in this video you're going to make the statement. He says, I hope you do this. Alright, so, my reasoning for citizenship, okay, comes from the transitive property of mathematics. If A equals B and B equals C, then A will equal C. Let me give that a little more clearly. If you have 5 apples and your friend also has 5 apples, then you can say, I have just as many apples as my friend. I have 5 apples, he has 5 apples, we have the same amount of apples. And that's a true statement. Okay. So, if a citizen in the United States has the right to vote, and you don't have the right to vote, then it comes into question whether you really are a citizen or not. See what I mean? Okay? And this is absolutely accurate if you go back, excuse me, if you go back to prior to the Civil War. Black people back at that time did not have the right to vote. So therefore, they were not really citizens of the United States. Even though they lived here, even though they were born here, they did not have the right to vote. Now do you see where I'm coming from? Now the kids were saying, well, because I was born here, I have the right to say whatever I like. Well, that's incorrect. Okay? And now I have the proof. Okay? I'm going to put 2 links down here. One is going to be full of court cases that will show you just how much children do not have the right to say whatever they like, despite the fact that they were born in this country, despite the fact that they're naturalized citizens. This is incorrect. Number 2, there'll be another thing down here that will establish that when you are a kid, your parents can tell you what you can and cannot say. Your parents can tell you where and where you cannot go. Your parents can tell you what you can and cannot buy. Your parents can keep you from voting. Your parents can keep you out of the military. Your parents can do this. Your parents can do that, so on and so forth. These are facts. Therefore, because you cannot exercise these rights that you're supposed to have because you're a naturalized citizen, then it comes into question whether you really are a citizen or not. Okay? You can say I'm a naturalized citizen all you want, but to be recognized as such, you have to be able to also exercise the very rights that are supposed to be granted unto you. And if you can't exercise those rights, there you go. Even women were not really considered citizens of the United States until after they got the right to vote, the right to own land, the right to do this, the right to do that. Now do you see my position? Being a citizen is far more than just being born in a country. It's being able to exercise your rights whenever you need to. That's the truest definition of a citizen. And by that definition, children are not citizens of these United States. Now that takes a lot of analytical thinking, but it's absolutely accurate. You see what I mean? So, hopefully I cleared up a lot of stuff, and you will be seeing a lot more videos where I will be a lot more specific about what I'm trying to do. The essence of the presentation that was sent to me was you need to get them to think for themselves about the points you're trying to make and get them to reason things out. And apparently I have failed to do so. So that is one thing I will correct from now on. And yes, you'll be seeing a lot more videos from me. He said once they start thinking for themselves and begin to realize all the things you've been trying to tell them, then hopefully they'll find a little more agreement with what you're trying to say. And it won't make you sound like such a meanie all the time. I hope so. We're going to give it a try and see how it works. Like I said, his emphasis was you have to try to get them to think for themselves, not just tell them what they should think. And he says, and that's your problem. He wished me all the best, and he said he will continue to work with me until I get the whole thing correct. And he says, you're on the right trail. He says, you're just using the wrong approach. He said, we're going to adjust your approach, but he says, you're doing what you should be doing. He says, you are challenging the system. And he says, you need to challenge it a lot, but in the right way. So I'm going to take his advice to verbatim, and we'll see how it goes. I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.